So good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Liz White. I'm the Executive Director of One Virginia 2021. We are co-sponsoring this event today with the League of Women Voters of Virginia. And Deb Wake, who is the president of the League in Virginia, is joining me. She's in the upper left-hand corner of my screen, if you want to wave to Deb. So since 2013, One Virginia 2021 has been a leader in the nonpartisan redistricting reform movement, specifically working in voter education and advocacy. And in just those few short years, we've helped raise the profile of redistricting from kind of a niche academic issue to one that actually motivates voters to action. We've built a supporter network of over 100,000 Virginians, and many of whom are on this call today. Thank you for being here. I know you all can't get enough of redistricting reform. We appreciate it. And we've helped move Virginia forward to the system we have today. There's been a lot of changes in Virginia and our redistricting system in the last year, and you're going to hear about a lot of them in detail today. But I do want to say here at the top of the program that I'm incredibly proud of the work that we've done in Virginia and the progress that Virginia has made in this area. Redistricting used to be something that happened behind closed doors with no requirements for transparency and very few rules about how the maps were drawn. The state constitution previously only required that districts be compact, contiguous, and of equal population. And compactness was at best a little bit of a squishy requirement. So not a lot of guidance. And now we have a bipartisan citizen-led commission of 8 citizens and 8 legislators. They are given a robust set of criteria and transparency requirements at every step of the process. I know we have some members of the commission on the call today. I'm so grateful that you're here. I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing. I thank you in advance for the incredible improvement on the maps that we're going to see out of your work. I hope the information today is helpful to you in this prodigious task you have before you. And to those of you involved in local redistricting, I know not all of the information discussed here today will apply to your process, but I do believe that most of it will be helpful and will translate to your mission as well. You don't have all of the same requirements for public engagement and transparency that the commission has, but I do want to take a moment to encourage you to listen to the best practices presented here today and incorporate them so that you can also move forward in an inclusive, community-based way when drawing your maps. We have an incredible group of experts with us today. I am just so honored that all of them have showed up and have said yes immediately and are so free and open with their expertise and their knowledge. I have found that that is true of the entire redistricting community. They're eager to share their resources and eager to move the entire country forward in this area. And I encourage you to use their knowledge, use their wisdom, and reach out to them as well. I'm going to turn it over to Deb for her introduction, and then we will move into the first section of our event.
Thank you, Liz. So welcome, everyone. The League just celebrated our 100th anniversary last year. We formed out of the right for women to vote, and voting is paramount to everything that we do. And redistricting, of course, is paramount to representation in a representative democracy. So we are nonpartisan and we focus on issues. In the 1950s, we started looking at redistricting and realizing the impact of it. We started advocating for it in the 1980s. And in 2011, we held a redistricting competition to show that good maps could be drawn by law students in this case, and not just legislators with some sort of mystical abilities. And after the decisions that came out of the Supreme Court in 2019, the National League decided that redistricting was so important, they were going to start a campaign across all 50 states, including the District of Columbia. And that is the people-powered fair maps, because we do think that fair maps put the power back in the hands of the voter. We were delighted to partner with One Virginia in trying to get the constitutional amendment passed in Virginia. We are so excited to have citizens as part of the process, and we are acting as an active watchdog on the process. And we do have a redistricting blog on our website where we try to break it down for those who aren't able to attend in person. So thank you so much, Liz, for including us today.
All right, we're going to move into our first section of the program today, which is all about the Voting Rights Act. So we're going to have, I'm going to introduce everyone who will be speaking, and then we'll turn it over. Our first speaker speaking on the Voting Rights Act and how it applies to redistricting is Yuri Radenski from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. Then we will go to Aleks Claville, who's the director of the Center for African American Public Policy at Norfolk State University. Actually, I'm going to give you their full bios first. We'll start. So Yuri Radenski is a redistricting counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. He focuses on redistricting reform and the intersection of race and redistricting. He's also an adjunct clinical professor at the NYU School of Law, where he teaches a course focused on public policy and impact litigation. Aleks Claville, who's going to talk to you about the Virginia Voting Rights Act that passed last session and the new Virginia criteria for redistricting, is the director of the Center for African American Public Policy at Norfolk State University, which is a think tank providing unbiased and nonpartisan research on public policy issues affecting African Americans and other people of color in Virginia and around the world. Christopher Lamar, who's going to talk to you about considerations for implementing maps with the Voting Rights Act in mind, is senior legal counsel at the Campaign Legal Center. His work primarily focuses on creating, protecting, and implementing independent redistricting commissions. He's helped draft such commissions for numerous states, as well as advocating for them in state legislatures around the country. He also represented litigants in federal, district, and appellate courts. Aleks Kajstura is going to talk to you about prison gerrymandering. She's the legal director at the Prison Policy Initiative, which is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan research and advocacy organization. And she specializes in developing interim solutions to the Census Bureau's decision to count prisoners where they are incarcerated as opposed to where they live in both state, county, and municipal governments. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Yuri. Thank you so much for being with us today, Yuri.
Thank you, and I am going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint. I hope it's up for everyone. Please let me know if you can't hear me or if you can't see the slides. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm Yuri Radenski. I'm a counsel in the democracy program at the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center is an independent, nonpartisan policy or law and policy organization that works to reform and revitalize our systems of democracy and justice, and redistricting advocacy has long been a central pillar of that mission. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Federal Voting Rights Act and what compliance looks like. This will be a whirlwind overview, but I know my fellow co-panelists will be expanding on some of the concepts I cover, and there should be time in the Q&A to dig a little deeper. Before I begin, I should say that I'm approaching this from the eyes of a VRA litigator trying to enforce the law in court, but we'll try to point out ways in which the VRA compliance can be a bit different from the standpoint of a map drawer or in advocacy, community advocacy as maps are being drawn. So to begin, the Federal Voting Rights Act is one of the, if not the crowning achievements of the civil rights movement, because voting and representation are the rights that are preservative of all others. The VRA was viewed as central to dismantling the Jim Crow regime of segregation. It passed in 1965 in the wake of the murder of voting rights advocates in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and the March on Selma. It is a law that was quite literally paid for in blood, and it secures all sorts of critical political rights for communities of color and language minorities, like the right to vote, including language access and fair representation. Today, we're going to focus on the representational aspects of the VRA, and the law stands as a check on vote dilution. Vote dilution, which is different than vote denial, occurs when the right to vote is available, but the electoral system discriminates against communities of color due to the district configuration or some other practices like holding at-large elections. The key provision of the VRA that will apply to redistricting this cycle is Section 2, which gives private plaintiffs, that is voters, the ability to challenge discriminatory schemes in court. Unfortunately, Sections 4 and Sections 5, which are also applicable to redistricting, are inoperative because of the Supreme Court's 2013 decision in Shelby County. Those parts of the VRA required states and localities with histories of discrimination, like Virginia, to submit maps for pre-clearance from federal officials before they took effect to ensure that they weren't discriminatory. The Supreme Court struck down the coverage formula, so this pre-clearance regime doesn't apply to any state or any locality at present, though the John Lewis Voting Rights Reauthorization Act, H.R. 4, could change that. I just wanted to highlight that before jumping into Section 2, which applies once maps are drawn and allows folks to challenge maps after they've taken effect. So this is the statutory language of Section 2. It applies, or it prevents schemes that give members of a protected class, which is communities of color. It prevents schemes that give those communities less opportunity than other members of the electorate to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of choice. So what does this language mean in practice? The Supreme Court in the 1980s interpreted this and gave effect to this language by creating a two-step inquiry. First, there's a quantitative inquiry, which are often called the three Jingles preconditions from the case that gave us this scheme called Thornburg v. Jingles. That quantitative inquiry first measures whether the community at issue is sufficiently large and geographically compact. Second, whether it's politically cohesive. And third, whether the white majority votes as a bloc to enable that majority in the absence of special circumstances, usually to defeat candidates of choice. There's also a second inquiry, which is a qualitative inquiry, which is a totality of the circumstances inquiry, which I will cover a bit as well. So the first Jingles precondition, that quantitative inquiry, is numerosity. The general rule is that a plaintiff in a VRA case must be able to demonstrate that the community on whose behalf the case is filed constitutes 50% plus one of the voting age population, often called VAP, or citizen voting age population, called CVAP, in order to be able to draw a district where that community forms an electoral majority. I'm going to draw a distinction between what you have to demonstrate in order to impose liability on a state or a locality, and what you must do in order to remedy a Voting Rights Act violation, because the Voting Rights Act is a law that's concerned with functional outcomes, meaning that that community is actually given an opportunity to elect candidates of choice. That 50% plus one number, if you're looking to actually draw a performing district, rather than demonstrate to a court that there is a claim there, can be different depending on things like the degree to which a community turns out, in elections and the degree to which white members of the electorate are willing to support the candidates of choice of that community of color. The other thing that I will mention is that district sizing can come into play here. For state legislative districts, there is some variance that's permitted when districts are drawn. It's generally considered that the deviation between the largest district, the most populous district, and the least populous district can be about 10%. And so when you're thinking about the VRA, when you're thinking about being able to demonstrate that you can form 50% plus one of the voting age population or the citizen voting age population to maintain a claim, you can think about, well, what should the overall population of the district be? And there is some wiggle room to play with in order to be able to demonstrate that a majority Black, Latino, Asian, or Native district is possible. I'll also put a little asterisk that it is possible to advocate on behalf of multiracial coalitions and combine the numbers of different groups that share political needs and share a political fate together, but there hasn't been definitive guidance from the Supreme Court on this question of coalition districts, as they're called, and this is certainly not the best Supreme Court to seek guidance on that question, at least not from the standpoint of voting rights advocates like myself. The next inquiry is political cohesion, and really this is about measuring the degree to which the community of color has common electoral preferences. But the other things to consider are whether the community has common political needs, whether the community or communities at issue suffer from the impacts of discrimination, and whether they have common social and economic outcomes. And when trying to articulate the cohesion of a particular community, it's important to remember what defendants will do, what people who are defending against VRA claims try to do, and it's to disaggregate the community. And this is particularly important when advocating on behalf of multi-ethnic racial groups like Latino communities, like Asian communities, and increasingly like Black communities, where defendants will claim that, well, the political needs of, say, Puerto Rican community members is different than the political needs of Mexican American community members. And so that's something to think about. And when you are dealing with multi-ethnic communities, even if they're part of the same overall racial group, you have to articulate a strong case for their political cohesion and political needs. The most contentious part of VRA claims is usually that third inquiry, where the court considers whether the majority votes sufficiently as a block to usually prevent the community of color from being able to elect their preferred candidate. A lot of the dispute centers around what elections are relevant to look at to make that determination. And it's generally one of the inquiries that's often deployed is called a racially polarized voting analysis, which looks the degree to which white voters and voters of color have differing political preferences. But the key is this racially polarized voting analysis is only relevant in elections where a true candidate of choice is present. And the thing about this inquiry is that a candidate of choice is not a candidate who receives a majority of votes from voters of color in a general election only. You have to dig deeper because there are instances, and for lack of a better metaphor, voters of color will choose, the lesser of two evils, or they will vote in an election even when a preferred candidate isn't present, and that doesn't automatically mean that if that community tends to vote the same way, that person in the general election is automatically a candidate of choice. So things that should be considered are, what do primary elections look like, and what are the tendencies at the primary stage? Where are different campaigns and candidates holding events? Where do contributions come from? And finally, what do platforms look like? Is there a responsiveness to the political needs of the community of color? Like I said, this tends to be the most contentious part of VRA work. Defendants usually try to include as many elections as possible. Plaintiffs try to limit the elections to the ones that truly contain preferred candidates. And one note I'll say about this is, if you're drawing at state legislative districts, you can look beyond state legislative races. You can consider races for local offices. You can consider even ballot initiatives to demonstrate these sorts of things. And then finally, there is that qualitative inquiry. And really, this is about telling the story of the community, and it's seeking to exercise its full political might and political power, and being thwarted repeatedly. These are the different things. They're often called the Senate factors, because this is what was listed when the VRA was first passed, but things like the history of discrimination, the use of other dilutive practices and discriminatory practices, the use of racial appeals in campaigns by white candidates, the significant lack of responsiveness of the political system to the needs of communities of color. These are the sorts of things that you can gather together to essentially say that this isn't just about any sort of favoritism toward communities of color. This is about solving a broader set of systemic racism and discrimination that these communities have suffered. That is why it's so critical that these communities get an equal opportunity to elect preferred candidates. That's all I have time for. I could speak about this for a lot longer, and please do reach out if you have additional questions, and certainly in the slideshow. I'm sorry, in the Q&A as well.
Yuri, thank you so much. We can stop sharing your screen, Yuri, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
so that background is beautiful. And then we're gonna pass the baton on to Eric Claville. Take it away, Eric.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thoroughly enjoyed the presentation previously. I felt I was back in law school class, but it's very, very well, a lot of great information. And it really sets the tone as where we are and where things are going and have been as it relates to voting rights and the challenges moving forward. The area I'm going to speak about first is the Virginia Voting Rights Act. The Virginia Voting Rights Act is the first we know in the South of a state passing a Voting Rights Act to protect. It's meant to protect the rights of voters in order to have access to the ballot, and also expand the access of the ballot box itself. We know that in Virginia had some of the tightest and also some of the most egregious Jim Crow era laws as related to voting. When we discuss these issues, especially to our classes and others, it's hard to believe that before what we have now with the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and even now with the expansion of access to the ballot box, it's hard to believe that there was a literacy test. It's hard to believe that there was a test where you had to guess how many jelly beans were actually in a jar, which who knows how many jelly beans are in a jar at any time. It's hard to believe that you had to pay a poll tax in order to vote, to have access to the ballot. And this was only meant for purely voter suppression of African Americans, giving new freedoms in order to play a part in the process of voting and choosing electors to be able to draft and pass public policy. I believe that public policy in its effect or in its purpose is meant to control and dictate people, resources, and also power. And that is a very, very influential part of our society. We are a society of laws, of course. And with that, you have the ability to choose your representative, choose the bills, choose the policy, public policy that you believe is the best for your area, your locality, your state, and also our federal government. That's a very, very powerful tool. In the words of the late, great John Lewis, the vote is the most powerful nonviolent tool that we have in our democracy. And it still remains that to this day. It's unfortunate that the bill, codenamed the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill, is remained stalled and really untouched moving forward, but hopefully we can push that through on the federal level. But on the state level, this last legislative cycle, Virginia passed the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, of course, does not supersede the federal Voting Rights Act. There's no state law that can supersede any federal law. So what does this law actually do? Does it repeat protections in the federal Voting Rights Act, or does it add some other protections? Is there ability for any type of state or federal challenges under the US Constitution as relates to a question of federal law? Actually, what this does, and one of the key provisions in this particular bill, is that it protects against the changes of requirements to vote. And that's very key and it's very important because every state has the power in order to determine the rules behind how you vote, okay? The ability to determine how long polls actually stay open, polling sites, how ballots are actually presented, how far you can be from a polling station, and the like. We saw in the last election in 2020 how the expansion of access to the ballot box really increased voter participation. We saw record numbers of every demographics, more specifically younger demographics and persons who had not voted ever, actually be able to vote. They were actually able to access the ballot box through many different ways through a safe and fair election. Now, I know there are a lot of false claims out there, and currently one party is really going through an infighting and possibly splitting over these false claims. But the statistics, the evidence clearly shows that the election was free, it was fair, and in many cases, it was effective in expanding access to the ballot. With that being the case, what the Virginia Voting Rights Act does, it protects those laws and those policies that are given to citizens in order to expand access to the ballot box. Well, what are those? If states or localities, if localities change rules or the state where you have to limit the type of ID requirements, you have to limit what types of, how long the polls can stay open and the like, this particular Voting Rights Act actually protects that. In addition to that, this particular bill, or this particular act itself, also gives the opportunity for localities and also the state itself to tend to go back and forth and determine what is the best way for their citizens to vote. And it gives an opportunity to flesh and hash this out in the state legislature. And I think it's very good in the sense that before you get a legal challenge to it, because legal challenges can spread things out. You can have litigation that lasts years as relates to certain issues under the right to vote. The other aspect of this before we transition to the Redistricting Commission and what we believe we can foresee from moving forward with this commission is that as states, more specifically Southern states, And you also have other states outside of the traditional South, as they tend to restrict access to the ballot box. We see where Virginia is increasing access to the ballot box. In that case, we believe that Virginia itself and this Voting Rights Act can serve as a model across the country to show what high level of participation can look like if voters' rights are protected under the law. So as we transition from the Voting Rights Act itself here in Virginia, we want to transition now to the federal, the Virginia Redistricting Commission. The Virginia Redistricting Commission itself is a 16-member commission made up of 8 elected officials and 8 citizens. The 8 citizens are selected by a panel of 5 retired judges from a list that is provided to the judges created by the elected officials themselves. Prior to the Redistricting Commission, the legislature would actually draw the districts, and then it would be presented, passed, and the governor would actually have veto power over it. The same process was in order to redraw these districts, like every state. The U.S. Census data is utilized. This year, we know that it's going to be a little different. Just a little point about the U.S. Census. I know that the 2020 election was the big talk during election season, of course, because of our former president, because of the pandemic, because of all these things that were going on. But we did not get a lot of talk about the U.S. Census. The U.S. Census is just as important. The U.S. Census is a process that takes place every decade that it really helps to set the tone for every state as relates to not just knowing their population, but also representation in Congress, and also drives economics within those various states. If you increase your population, of course, the economics drivers, housing, schools, tax base, entertainment, and the like, that's going to also drive that particular economy in your state. If you lose population, which some states have, then of course it's going to retract. So it's very important in that sense. The restrictions that were placed upon getting the census data that we need to redraw our lines every 10 years was also something that was under attack, along with access to the ballot on the federal level. There have been, but we feel very confident that the data that we secured during that time period is good data and data to be utilized across the country. So that's just my point about the U.S. Census data. But back to the Redistricting Commission. The idea of the commission, and believe it or not, a lot of Republicans were against this prior to this year, but many did an about face and came in agreement with it. More specifically, at the time, the Speaker of the House, Kirkland Cox, former Speaker, was in favor of it. And they believe that this would help to take out partisan politics from redrawing district lines. Now, we know that redrawing district lines, there have been traditional challenges, what we call gerrymandering, which is an older term that's used in politics, where you basically take a district and configure it in a way that works best for your political party or whoever's in power at the time, through various methods that was articulated in the presentation prior to this one. But one of the challenges that we see with this Redistricting Commission is that within the amendment itself, it states that, I have it pulled up here, it states that the legislative commissioners themselves, this is under section 3392C, citizen commissioners selected to serve as commissioners of the Virginia Redistricting Commission shall be selected by the Redistricting Selection Committee as provided in section 394. In making the selections, the committee shall give consideration, not a mandate, but consideration to racial, ethnic, geographic, and gender diversity of the Commonwealth. One of the chairman of the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus, Delegate Bagby, who's also an alum of Norfolk State University, stated that he has trepidation and pause because of the potential dilution of African-American influence on the redrawing of the lines. Now, we do know that there are African-American that are serving on the commission right now through the elected committee process. But before, the citizens themselves really did not reflect what we saw to be the population of Virginia. This is something that we'll see moving forward, how it affects the lines that are being drawn. We know that within the provision of the Constitution itself, if there is a dispute, the Virginia court will be able to hear that dispute and then, of course, decide it. But the governor plays, and one of the key provisions of this as well is that the governor plays no role in this redistricting process. So there's really no backstop from the legislative process. It's through this commission, voted on, approved, or a legal challenge. For some that believe that the partisan politics by this commission is removed, there are those that believe that the partisan politics is just starting. So with this, we will see how the commission works, how the process works itself. Of course, the hearings are public, the meetings are public. They are printed in multiple languages. There are several meetings that must be held before the actual plan goes forth and is approved for public feedback and the like. And the public can play a part in their feedback, and it is taken into consideration, but there's no mandate that whatever the public says or feedback that's given are implemented in the changes. So that is also a key provision as well. Ultimately, the provisions to give public access and hearings to this process is fair. They are also subject to FOIA's Freedom of Information Act. However, the selection of the committee members, who's in power at the time, and of course, the 8 elected officials are an even between the two controlling parties at that time. But again, we will see how the influence on these districts actually play out moving forward and see the effectiveness of the commission. So in conclusion, Virginia has again started to move the dial in innovation and also answering the clarion call of being more accountable to the public and creating changes in the process to provide access to the ballot box, but also providing citizen input and influence in the process as it relates to redrawing our lives.
Eric, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it right over to Chris Lamar from the Campaign Legal Center.
Thanks, Liz. I'll wait for there you go. So I'm Chris Lamar, Senior Legal Counsel with the Campaign Legal Center. The Campaign Legal Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to advancing democracy through law. I myself, for example, have represented plaintiffs in cases in federal VRA cases in Virginia Beach, actually, and also in state VRA cases in Washington State. So I guess, I'm talking about the VRA and during the implementation process with in the redistricting process. And so I guess the first question, right, is why are VRA considerations important during implementation? To me, the answer to that is that, bad actors, both past and present, have tried to sort of mute the power of communities of color in the redistricting process. So, again, I'm picking on Virginia Beach just because we just had a decision there recently where a federal court found that the Virginia Beach method of electing city council members diluted the voices of the minority community to be able to elect the candidate of their choice. And, even before that, right, in the previous redistricting cycle, a federal court also found that the way that the Virginia legislature drew the various lines, both legislative and congressional, violated the state VRA or I'm sorry, the federal VRA. So I guess now that we kind of know what's important about the redistricting, or why the VRA is important in the implementation process, sort of what can be done during the implementation process. For people who are, not commissioners, there are lots of things that they can do. They can show up to public hearings. They can draw community maps, so they can draw maps themselves to talk about sort of how they view their communities. They can analyze the data of maps that have been proposed by commissioners. They can also submit oral and written testimony about, about their communities or about their thoughts about the maps that the commission may have drawn. For the commission, they can, look at what I think Yuri hit on this earlier when we talk about racially polarized voting, which is, when the minority community votes for one candidate in a race, and the majority, which is normally the white community, votes for a different candidate in a race, in that same race. That's sort of what we're talking about, racially polarized voting. And so the commission can look at, the voting history within the state and within, sort of smaller jurisdictions to figure out what the communities within those jurisdictions look like. The commission can also look at the history of discrimination in jurisdictions or within places across the state. So, and it's not just, I think someone, I can't remember if it was Eric or Yuri who talked about this, but, it's not just about, it's not just about, Jim Crow stuff about poll taxes and like more Jim Crow era stuff about poll taxes and counting jelly beans in a jar, but it's also stuff more recently, right? Like, so again, I'm talking about Virginia Beach just because this just happened, but for example, in Virginia Beach in the city council race, there's evidence of white voters getting sample ballots that only had white candidates on it, and black voters getting a sample ballot that had the same white candidates on it, but also had one additional candidate who happened to be black. And so this idea of using these sample ballots and passing out different sample ballots based on the skin tone of the voter sort of, highlights maybe the issues that may be plaguing that jurisdiction and determining how the people within those jurisdictions should maybe have different representation of those types of things. Some of the other things to consider, such as like disparities in other areas, such as education and health outcomes. And so, I think those things are very, very important. I think Liz talked about this earlier, where previous cycles with the redistricting process in Virginia tended to happen behind closed doors. People weren't really allowed to be involved in the process, but with this new redistricting reform that Virginians have enacted, people are now able to have more of a say in the process, and the process is supposed to be more open and transparent. So this is very important to be able to hear what people from various communities think about their communities, right? Like I think one of the examples I always think about, and like I talk about this story all the time, is that in the previous California redistricting cycle, they also have a redistricting commission that's a little bit different than Virginia, but for the purposes of the story, it's close enough, where before sort of listening to the community, the commission drew some proposed maps. And in those proposed maps, one of the districts that they drew, it put two different Native American tribes within the same district, right? And the reasoning was kind of sort of what you think would make sense. It was that, they're both Native American tribes. They probably have a lot of the same issues and that kind of stuff. Fast forward to one of the first public hearings in this area of California, representatives from both Native American tribes showed up, and they both testified, do not put us in the same district as the other Native American tribe. But for the fact that the Native Americans from these two different tribes showed up and talked about what they believe their communities to be and how they believe the map should be drawn, the commission would have had no idea. And so it's very important for people across Virginia to be able to talk about their communities and sort of figuring out ways to draw, majority minority districts. And so that's my presentation. So I just want to, emphasize that it's very important to be able to hear from people about what they consider to be their communities.
Thank you so much, Chris. And lastly, for this section, I'm going to pass this over to Aleks to talk about prison gerrymandering.
Thanks. So I guess looking at the time, I'm going to kind of give a crash course, bare bones on prison gerrymandering in Virginia specifically, which isn't too bad because Virginia has ended prison gerrymandering as much as it can going into the 2020 redistricting cycle. So, you know, we've had folks talk about the VRA and the analysis that you can do to make sure that the districts are representative of the people who are there. And a lot of that is based on the census data plus talking to the community. What prison gerrymandering does, though, is it's this kind of way of gerrymandering that can sneak past people because it's hidden in the data itself. So when you're using the Census Bureau's data to redistrict, the Census Bureau counts incarcerated people at the location of the facility where they are on census day rather than at their home address. So you're basically working with data that counts huge swaths of people in the wrong place. So you're attributing them to districts where they have no connection with the community, where they're not represented by the representatives who then claim that population to fill that district, when we're talking just even on the basis of having equal population between the districts. You're looking at districts that, once you take the correctional populations into account, if people were actually counted at home, would just look vastly different, would be far from any allowable deviation in populations. We have over 20 state house districts in the country that are over 10% incarcerated, meaning that 10% or more of that district is just people who are counted in prisons there rather than people who actually reside in our constituents of that district. And Virginia has one of those. District 75 has 12% incarcerated population, meaning that 12% of the district, of the population that's counted to make that district kind of equal to the other districts, aren't actual constituents of that district. And when you're looking at the local level, it's even starker. Southampton County has a Board of Supervisors district, so it's like a county local district that is 50% incarcerated. So literally half the people who live in that county district have the same power as half the population of that district has the same power as the full population of any other county district. And these kind of big impacts at the local level are really what started driving prison gerrymandering reform. You saw these local governments were the first ones to notice that there was a problem in the first place, because, you know, when you're drawing a seat in some of these places, like one facility is even larger than the whole population of any of the county districts. So you'd be facing drawing a seat that would never get filled on the council. And so then, you know, folks kind of realized, oh, there's something wonky with this data. And they basically correct the data on their own, adjust it to make sure it's just reflective of the local population there, and draw their districts that way. And there are over 200 municipalities and counties and other local governments that have done this independently across the country. And now we have, going into 2020, 9 states that are going to be doing a statewide adjustment, and Virginia is one of those. So what you'll be doing is taking the census data and data from your Department of Corrections, and it's the Division of Legislative Services that's going to be doing the actual adjustment. They'll take both of these data sets, make sure that they basically remove the population from the correctional facilities and put everybody back at home. So, and then they'll publish that data. That'll be used for state legislative districts as well as the local districts. So now the counties and the cities will have that data on which they can redistrict. And the redistricting shift in Virginia actually started about a decade ago. There was a series of bills aimed to help the local governments first that were having trouble with the census data, that they were kind of forced to draw these districts in some cases that had huge swaths of population that weren't their county residents at all. And so building on those early bills that allowed and then forced county governments to use an adjusted census data. Now the state itself will be using that data, will be providing that data to the counties, so they don't have to do any of the work on their own. And just kind of wanted to know on that adjustment, basically, you're taking two data sets that weren't meant to be compatible. And so this is when you see what's coming out of the Division of Legislative Services, they might say, like, we could only map 70, 80% of the addresses, because out of the Department of Corrections, the data's, it's inconsistent, let's say. Sometimes there'll be zip codes missing, which is easy enough to look up. But if you're looking up a zip code for thousands of people, that adds up time, that adds error into the data. If you have like street versus avenue, that's kind of harder to find. Some people will just have a PO box. Some people were unhoused before going in. Some people just won't have an address available. So when you're looking at these adjustments, keep in mind that it's very much about getting a data set that's closer to reality and better represents people's home than the data you started with. So it's not going to be perfect. And particularly when you're looking at VRA and race and ethnicity analyses of the districts and that impact, at the Department of Corrections, I actually not sure what the data looks like in Virginia. I know in most cases is not data that's self-reported in terms of race and ethnicity. I know some states don't even collect Hispanic as an option. So it's going to be, you're going to get somewhat of a mismatch, which will make the VRA analysis a little bit trickier. You'll probably want to run the analysis both like a couple ways, assuming you're basically making assumptions about the quality of the race and ethnicity data that you're getting. And the Census Bureau is going to be publishing the location of the correctional facilities as well. And they're working on limiting the impact of this new differential privacy system that they have going, which is basically they're making the data more private by introducing a little bit of what they call noise into it. So they'll like take one person and move them over a block, just so that you can't pinpoint every person. In some cases, it was more than one person and it became a problem. But they're really narrowing down on the impact of that on demographic analysis, particularly in the prison locations for states that need to do this kind of address reallocation. I'm happy to take questions in the Q&A.
Aleks, thank you so much. We are now going to put all of our speakers from this section on the screen so that they are open for questions. We've got a couple in the chat that I will bring up. Let's see. The first one, I think, Chris, I think you are the one who brought up this example. In California, what reasons did the representatives of the two Native American tribes give to the commission for not putting their members in the same district?
I don't 100% remember, but I believe the two tribes just had different economic bases. Like I think one was more agricultural and rural, while the other was more like it was like something related to casinos or something. But don't quote me on that. But I feel like the way that they sort of lived was just completely different than the other, versus like some historical animosity between the two kind of thing.
And Pete, I know you're the one who asked that question. We actually are going to have 3 of the former California commissioners on the call in the second half. So they might actually have some more details on that as well. And one of them wanted to know if the map drawing by the commission is going to be virtual and transparent to the public. For example, can the public see the commissioners discussing reasons for moving census blocks, et cetera, in real time? I honestly don't know that we have an answer to that yet. I think that some of those logistical decisions are still being worked out by the commission. So far, all of the meetings and all of the working groups have been open to the public and live streamed and transparent. I don't know if any of you have any additional details on that. I know only Eric is in Virginia, so it's kind of more of a
Yeah.
nationally focused call.
No, Liz, to your point, again, those things are being worked out, but they have to be open. So it is a mandate under the constitutional amendment that it has to be open, and they have to have X amount of hearings, public hearings. So how they will be held, we'll see. How many persons will be allowed. But again, as I pointed out, the effectiveness of the feedback and the input is really the question. You can attend, you can hear, you can get feedback, but how far will it go as influencing the process? So I think that's the big question.
And I think the transparency measures, I would just add, I think the transparency measures that are in the new reforms and the new laws and the constitutional amendment really amplify every other part of it, because if you can't publicly explain why you've put a line somewhere without it being a nefarious or self-serving or illegal reason, if you can't explain that before the public, then you can't put the line there. And I think that that's going to really help all of us be a part of the process and be watchdogs and really be able to weigh in with all the information. Apparently you all are incredibly clear, because that seems to be all the questions in this section, which actually puts us ahead of schedule. Look at that. So thank you all for being part of this this call and this event. And you are free to go if you'd like, or you can stick around. Thanks so much. And I'm going to hand it over to Deb for the next section.
Thanks, Liz, and thank you to our first panelists.